everybody, and welcome back to another episode in our podcast series focusing on insights for supplemental insurers. My name is Christy McGuire, and I am the Vice President of Business Solutions for the Americas. Thank you for joining us back again. I'm excited about today's episode because I will be speaking with our guest on the emotional impact when moving a loved one to a care home. It's estimated that there are 2.2 million people today living in long-term care facilities across the U.S. And around 7 out of 10 people will require assisted living care at some stage in their lives, highlighting the increasing demand for supportive services among the aging population. Joining me today to talk about this is Amanda Subrizzi. Amanda is a licensed clinical mental health counselor with extensive experience in crisis management. She's earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from East Carolina University, and she went on to complete a master's in education in clinical mental health counseling at North Carolina State University. Amazing background. Amanda has worked in an intensive outpatient program with residential treatment, providing mental health support. And today at Workplace Options, Amanda has worked as an employee assistance program counselor, and she currently holds the leadership role overseeing clinical operations and leading teams in the delivery of high-quality mental health care. Nobody better to join this podcast today to educate our listeners than you, Amanda, so thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So I know this is a really important topic, and there's probably a lot of listeners that have had to deal with caregiving from many different aspects. Can you start out by defining the difference for our audience between anticipatory grief and grief after the loved one is placed in long-term care?
Yeah, of course. That's a great question. So I think anticipatory grief is a huge part of grief that can be overlooked or not as expected. So essentially, anticipatory grief is going to be what happens when you know there's going to be some type of loss, but it hasn't yet occurred. So this is going to start to set in before you actually start the grieving process. You know, some of these common feelings can be hopelessness, confusion, guilt, dread, you name it, you're probably feeling it. For example, a loved one may be given a few months to live, and during those months leading up to their passing, you're living in this state of emergency. So your nervous system is constantly on edge, waiting for something bad to happen. As you can imagine, when you're in survival mode, it's extremely hard to relax and take care of yourself. Going back to, at this point, you know there's not much time left with them. And they're still currently here, so your emotions may feel a bit all over the place because you're not really quite sure where to start, what to do, how to take care of yourself. This is going to feel like a waiting period of the inevitable happening, but being in a limbo state where you're not fully capable of processing that grief yet because it hasn't quite occurred yet. Another good example of anticipatory grief can be someone struggling with Alzheimer's. So you're watching them be physically present, but at the same time, you're watching parts of them disappear. I wanted to talk a little bit on a heavier note about sometimes a person may even wish that a sick loved one could hurry and pass. You know, I know that can be a hard thought to even say or think about, but it can be a process of grieving. So feeling this way can cause people to feel really guilty, you know, because it may feel morally wrong to think such a thing. But I think it's important to notice it's not that someone wants this person to maybe pass away, but they're so uncomfortable with this limbo period, this watching someone be sick and in pain, and then while they're also in pain. And so they want to just move forward.
You know, I think what's hard is when you have a loved one that's in that state, and the anticipatory grief is really hard to deal with because I think there's constant anxiety around, you know, this is coming. It could be tomorrow. It could be 5 years from now, depending on the situation. And it just seems like every day you're constantly thinking about it. And so, you know, as a caregiver, it's really hard to deal with that every day until you're right. You just think, wow, if this person was out of their misery and passed away, I would be better. But on the other side, you don't want that to happen because you don't want that day to come. So I know it's really challenging for people to process that, and it can consume their thoughts. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's really all people think about during this time. And I think that's what makes it so hard is because you can't start that grieving process and just that guilt can really eat you up.
Before we move into the next question, I want to share a story with everyone that actually just recently came in from our clinical team. A member sought out counseling support due to anticipatory grief over her father having terminal cancer. She reported feeling conflicted due to the unhealthy nature of her and her father's relationship, and she explained that her father was abusive to her emotionally, and they haven't spoken for many years throughout her life. But due to her father nearing the end of his life now, she was feeling guilty and really confused as to how to communicate with her father now and how to express how much she actually cared about him and she wanted to reconnect with him. She expressed wanting, her father to pass away, but because she just wanted to get to the point where she could grieve and move on, she was hoping he would just pass. I think there was guilt over these feelings because it could be taboo to feel this way over a parent. But I know she really struggled with both parts of her mind in terms of how she should feel, wanting to get it over with because of all of her anger, but yet the feelings of, I still want to have all these things I need to tell you before that happens. How do caregivers differentiate between guilt and grief during this process?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really powerful story that you just shared. And I can only imagine how someone feels going through that because it is extremely difficult to have someone you love, but also have a lot of abuse that you are endured. And when you are encountering someone about to pass, you may start to reflect back on the entire life and feel like you don't have that much time left to really find a solution or work through things. Guilt and grief during this process can be really difficult to differentiate because they can occur at the same time. Grieving obviously includes various feelings such as anger, denial, sadness around some type of major loss in your life. That could be a pet loss, job loss, a loved one passing away. There could be many reasons to grieve. Now, within grieving, a common emotion felt is going to be that guilt. For example, someone having to make a difficult decision about the best type of care for a loved one may start to feel guilty based on the decision that they choose. So this might even come up just by merely contemplating the idea of putting someone in long-term care. You might feel just because this thought popped in your head, you're doing something wrong. And that guilt can come from whatever values or beliefs that you may hold or think is important to hold. So if you're going against what is the norm, it may bring up those feelings of guilt even more. A lot of that guilt is going to sound like having unrealistic expectations for yourself, having an idea that you must do everything for them. You must visit someone every day. You have to put aside all your boundaries and they're your sole purpose at this point. Maybe you might even feel guilty by having a good time. Maybe you just had a good day with friends and you feel bad about that because someone else you love is suffering and that means you should be in the same pain. So that's when that guilt can come up. There might be, kind of like this case study, regretting things about your relationship before that diagnosis. So maybe wishing you had more conversations with that person, wishing you didn't fight over certain things so that guilt can arise. I think overall, grieving can trigger the emotions of guilt. So it's almost a subsection of grief, but it's not grief itself. There's not one emotion that someone has to feel for it to be considered grieving, but there are a lot of common feelings that someone might feel.
Yeah, I would say that feeling the guilt is just sort of a natural human instinct that immediately pops up when you're dealing with grief. Would you say? I mean, it just comes present into the mind for everybody. And it's really, really hard to get those thoughts out of your brain. And I think that there are some cultural and societal expectations that increase that make people feel this way. Like, for example, I'm a working parent. I have 3 kids. Both of my parents are in their 80s. They don't live in the same town. They live far away from here. My brother's there, but I have this guilt all the time of, if something happens to one of them, I can't take care of them immediately. I'd have to reshift my whole dynamics. Or Think about women as caretakers. They just feel this need to want to bring the parent into the home and really take care of them and do all of these things. So do you feel like that pushes that element of guilt, the cultural or societal expectations?
Yeah, of course. I definitely think there's many different factors that can increase those feelings of guilt. So in my personal experience, as an Italian American, there can be this general idea that the child takes care of the parents once they're old and sick. If you decide to go against this and put someone in a home, there can be judgment from outsiders or even individuals within your own family. I think that can put a lot of stress and guilt on somebody. If you do something different than what your own culture says is the right thing to do. And I don't think that's just for Italian Americans. I think that can be said from a lot of other cultures as well. I think something important that you mentioned is the gender norm. Being a woman, there can be a lot of pressure of feeling like your role is to take care of others. Society really puts that pressure on us to be the nurturer, to take care of others, which may not be right for everyone, and that's completely okay to have a different way of living your life. So, it can feel like an obligation to put an individual in your home instead of long-term care. So again, if you're going against that, your own personal values to be a caretaker, but you just can't mentally take on that load, that can cause some internal conflict within yourself, which causes that guilt. Since you are going against the grain and maybe what you even feel like you should do. I think another thing is socioeconomic factors that can contribute to guilt. Maybe a family is concerned about the financial burden of putting someone in a home and having that guilt over the expenses that come with long-term care, because it can be very expensive. It might be cheaper for someone to be cared for in your own home. Then you're going to have to sacrifice other things like your own well-being, your self-care, and you have to kind of put in perspective of what is best for you in your life during that time. So, depending on how abundant money is in your family, it could be a huge sacrifice and burden to have that cost. But I think it's important to think overall of just because you feel guilty about something does not necessarily mean you're doing something wrong. I think a way to decipher between this is looking at what you particularly value and believe versus what you think you should value. Are you taking on somebody else's values and beliefs, whether that be within your culture or your parents and how you were brought up, or is this what you truly believe is best for you? I think a strategy to help figure that out could be creating, some type of pros and cons list of, before you're making this decision, maybe look at what it would look like if you were to bring someone in your home. How would you still take care of yourself? What would the financial aspects of that be? And then doing the opposite of if you were to put someone in long-term care, again, what those pros and cons would look like. And then coming up for yourself, what would be the best way forward?
Everything you just said is incredibly powerful. If the average individual could just hear what you just said to sort out these things in the way you just said, that's what people need. I think the average individual today is so busy. They have crazy lives. And when the unexpected happens and you have to start this process, it is way overwhelming. Nobody feels like they have time. And that's when they hit a wall. And that's when your mind gets out of control, the guilt voice comes in, and everything else starts to flood, and then you as an individual feel burnt out, tired. It can be really hard to push it forward. So if you think about that, as a caregiver, how do you recommend people stop to manage their emotional health that this transition is going to have on them, while also caring for themselves and potentially others? Do you have any other suggestions? Because if everybody could just have a conversation with you with what you just said to sort out all of those things, it would really help a lot of people.
Yeah. So I'm going to be honest. It can be extremely difficult to manage your own mental health while caring for someone else. That doesn't mean it's not possible. So it is important to remind yourself that it's okay to seek additional support because you might not have all the answers yourself. Taking care of yourself is not selfish. So I'm always going to recommend going to therapy and having that safe place to process those emotions. During that, you can come up with boundaries that help yourself manage your own well-being while also caring for somebody else. It's important to not lose your own identity. You are still your own person. You're allowed to have needs, wants, and hobbies. And it's even more important during that time to still do those things. You're not a bad person just because someone else is suffering, to still live your own life. As I say, you got to put your own mask on before you help somebody else. And I would say some of the most important things to remember is accepting whatever emotion you are feeling, setting boundaries, seeking support, practicing self-care, and asking for help. One good thing could be grief support groups, meeting with other people, experiencing similar things. This can help normalize what you're experiencing, and just hearing what others suggest, as well as having maybe those individual therapies to talk about what's specifically going to help you.
And I want to be clear that in these situations, seeking support for your mental health is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of empowerment. You're just trying to take care of yourself and process the needs that you have to be able to make this work, right?
Yeah, 100%. It takes a lot of strength to reach out and ask for help, so it is 100% a strength.
Now, throughout the whole process that someone may experience from beginning to end, is there a specific recommendation that, caregivers should seek therapy at a certain time during this process? I feel like sometimes people wait till the very end to do it, when really maybe the best time is once this process starts happening to you, is to go ahead and seek support right away, right?
Yeah. So I recommend considering therapy sooner rather than later. Even if you're managing okay at the current moment, that doesn't mean there's not going to be a time that comes up where things are tougher. And I think having those tools to have in your pocket for when things are tough, it's going to be easier for you than, having to call somebody and seek out therapy when you're already struggling. It can be hard to make that phone call. I think it's a great place to be able to start. As soon as you know that someone might have this diagnosis, going ahead, calling a therapist and getting that set up, so then you can have that support through every process that you experience. There could be things that you don't even know are going to come up. Maybe you're not as sad as you expected to be after someone passes, and that can make you feel guilty and like you're doing something wrong. So it could be a good time to process that in therapy as well. You don't always have to be super struggling to seek out therapy support.
And being that our listeners are from supplemental insurers, whether it's an individual that is buying a policy to support caregiving or long-term care or whatever benefit it is, the element of having the ability for the claimants to have direct access to receive mental health support is extremely powerful, wouldn't you say? Giving people the ability to not only get the care they need for their loved ones, but to take care of their mental health in tandem. And it can be done in a very easy 24/7 anonymous way.
Yeah. I mean, the easier it is to access this mental health support, the more likely people are going to be able to work on themselves. We want to make sure there's not barriers to seeking support.
Well, thanks, Amanda. This was really, really great. I personally learned a lot through this whole entire discussion, and will definitely take these topics to mind myself in the near future. And for everybody else that joined, thank you so much. To learn more about WPO products and services, or to share your simple feedback with us, you can connect with us directly through the Contact Us page on the Workplace Options website. The link can be accessed directly from the podcast page. Thank you, everybody, and take care.